much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, I'll be happy to relay your comments to the parties you described. And as you know, the President has directed the Secretary of Agriculture to use every power that is at his disposal to help the agriculture parties who are adversely affected by retaliation. But I will communicate what you've said to the White House.
The President we heard the President say that to the Secretary of Agriculture, and in the process, all the senators around the table said, we don't want money from the Treasury, we want markets. Yeah. Thank you, Mr.
Senator Bennet.
Just to follow up on Chairman Grassley's question, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? What are you going to make available to our farmers and ranchers? What do you propose? When Ambassador Lighthizer was sitting there, he said, your farmers and ranchers have my sympathy because they'll be the first people that will suffer retribution if there's a trade war. And I said, they don't need your sympathy. They need you to act reasonably. What do you now propose for our farmers and ranchers? What do you mean when you say the Secretary of Agriculture should do everything he can do? Who, by the way, I think opposes these policies, but...
Well, I'm not in detail familiar with all of the tools the Secretary...
But how can you not be familiar with them? You've come here and testified that that's how you're going to solve the issue. It's like describing these steel prices that are going straight up like this as antisocial behavior and not a result of the tariffs. That is not true.
Well, I disagree with you, Senator.
The antisocial behavior, even accepting that description, was certainly provoked by the tariffs, wasn't it?
No, sir.
Would it have existed with no tariffs?
I think they viewed the tariffs as an opportunity for them to profiteer.
Thank you. They are related to the tariffs. So what do you propose the Agriculture Secretary should do? A policy opposed by my Republican colleagues, but what should they do?
Well, it's up to the Secretary of Agriculture to come because each of the segments of agriculture is quite a different segment. I think he heard very clearly the comment from the farm state representatives that they don't want government aid. Well, we have no control over what another country does in retaliation. But what the President just did announce to try to discourage retaliation when the Chinese on the 301 announced that they would match the $50 billion of product that we have put tariffs on with their $50 billion, the President put tariffs, or said he will put tariffs on $200 billion. That's a very significant number.
It sounds like the beginning of a trade war to me, Mr. Secretary, and I think the sensitivity maybe on Capitol Hill might be that we're looking at a $1 trillion deficit next year, the largest deficit that we've seen outside of a recession or outside of a war because of this administration's policies. So my point is I don't think you're going to have any backstop for our farmers and ranchers, and to blindly pursue these policies without considering what happens to them, I think is a huge mistake. I'd like to ask you, following on to the Chairman's questions of you, Mr. Secretary, what is it about the Canadian steel industry that is a national security interest to the threat to the United States?
Oh, the Canadian steel industry is not being accused of directly and individually being a security threat.
What is our trade deficit in steel with Canada?
We don't have a trade deficit of note.
We don't?
No, sir.
Do we have a surplus with Canada in
Yes,
steel?
sir. We have a surplus in dollars.
So does that
May I
surplus?
finish my answer?
Sure, of course.
We have a surplus in dollars. We do not have a surplus in physical volume.
Okay,
What happens is steel...
Mr. Secretary, what is the national security threat of the trade surplus that the United States has with Canada in steel?
The national security implication is in the aggregate all of the steel.
But why would you put a tariff on, what is the national security basis for the tariff that you have placed on Canada? I understand what we're supposed to be doing with China. I don't understand why the President's not focused on it. I don't understand why he's excluding ZTE. I don't understand it. What is the national security rationale for putting a tariff on the Canadian steel industry with whom we have a trade surplus?
Yeah, if you would let me finish the answer,
I will.
I'll try to do so. The reason the tariff is being put on essentially all countries, most of whom are friendly countries and have good relations with us, and some others of which also have surpluses with us. The reason it has to be a global solution is if you just looked at the raw data, you wouldn't think China is a problem for the U.S. because what they've been doing is masking their exports to us by shipping them through other countries. So the raw data, if you just believe the raw numbers, China is shipping less to us than they did 5 years ago. The reality is quite to the contrary. They are disrupting the global steel markets. They are causing both direct and indirect damage to it. So we have to do it on a global basis. I'm not quite finished. Sir.
I'm sorry.
The good news is that as a direct result of the 232s, suddenly Europe is enacting safeguards against steel dumping into Europe. They didn't do much before. Canada is taking action. Japan, for the first time, has created an enforcement body within METI to deal with the problem. The only way we're going to solve the global steel overproduction and overcapacity is by getting all the other countries to play ball with us. And while they're complaining bitterly about the tariffs, the fact is they're starting to take the kind of action which, if they had taken sooner, would have prevented this crisis.
Senator, your time is up. Senator Roberts.
Thank